Welcome to 5 Dubs by MDDC Press. I'm your host, Rebecca Snyder, the Executive Director of the Maryland, Delaware, and DC Press Association, which represents news media in our region. 5 Dubs focuses on the who, what, when, where, and why of local news media. We'll talk with the journalists about the stories behind the news. You can find more information about our guests in the show notes or on our website, www.5-dubs.com. Welcome. I am so excited to have Brandi Swicegood here with me today. She is from the Sunlight Research Center, which is an organization dedicated to deep backgrounding of political candidates. So welcome to the program, Brandi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here with you today, Rebecca.
Well, and I was excited to talk to you. I recently learned about your organization and I was ensorcelled a little bit. I was spellbound to find, that you are helping individuals and newsrooms really do a lot of the deep dives on candidates. And you have some great chops to be able to do this. You're a veteran investigative journalist, spending about the last 2 decades reporting and editing stories from politics and immigration to criminal justice and the environment, and working mainly, it seems like, in the Southwest in Texas, in the Dallas Morning News and of course USA Today, and coming to us from Fort Collins, Colorado. So tell us a little bit about the Sunlight Research Center and what you're hoping to achieve with it.
Sure. Sunlight Research Center is dedicated really to helping boost the storytelling and investigative capacity of newsrooms that really are under-resourced and don't have the time and the skills to do the kind of deep research that their communities really need to make informed decisions, particularly now as we go into this important election. But even beyond that, helping journalists to do the deep investigative work that their communities need to really be informed. So we're really excited about the work that we're doing and the ability to help journalists. And so what we've been working on for the last several months, really since a little bit before July, is training newsrooms how to do deep backgrounding on candidates. So right now we have a 5-session training that we provide to reporters, and it's really designed to help reporters put together sort of a chronology, a timeline of a candidate's life, so that they can see where the events in that candidate's life might overlap in potentially newsworthy ways. So we kind of did an experiment with George Santos to see what we could learn from that case. It's sort of an outlier, right?
Well, it was so bold. You kind of think, well, how did no one put those pieces together? And so, as the sort of person that kind of engendered that, how did you put that together to use him as a test case?
So we wanted to know, like, what was knowable about Santos before he was actually elected to office. Was there a way that voters could have been more fully informed? So we set out to obtain all the public records we could get about him that would have been available before he was elected. So we got all of those records and we put them together in a timeline format. It's pretty simple, straightforward spreadsheet, right? This happened this date. These are the people who are involved. This is the document you can see. This is the sort of, short description of the events. And doing that allowed us to see that really from the outset, he was making these sort of outlandish false claims. Like, you could see that at the same time his mom was living abroad, he was claiming that she was in the 9/11 attacks. You can see that at the same time he was claiming that he worked at places like Goldman Sachs, he was actually getting evicted from pretty modest apartments in New York City. So those are pieces you could have put together. And it really showed us how important it is to have this timeline so that you can see where important claims overlap with, with factual documentation that you can see. And also it allows you to keep track of sources. So after we did that, we put together a template for newsrooms to use that is both a timeline and a source list that we feel like is a really helpful way to at least get started with this kind of reporting.
Mhm. And so what are you finding when you're working with newsrooms or in your own experience, how do reporters generally kind of go about this work? I mean, when you did this backgrounding on George Santos, obviously reporters weren't going as deep. And so what do you find that when a reporter says, I'm going to background this candidate or this person, what do they normally do?
I think that's a really good question, because it varies so much from candidate to candidate and but circumstance to circumstance. I think one of the most challenging things as a reporter, right, is that when you start to background someone, you're sort of starting with a blank slate, right? Like,
Mhm.
where do you even begin? And I think that that's where this timeline and source list really come in clutch, because you have sort of a template to start from. You can say, okay, I need to start filling in the blanks here. But a really great place to start, right, is just with the candidate's own biography, with their own website, marking down in that timeline the claims that they're making on their website, so that then you can use that to go back and verify. You can see, well, if they claimed they worked in this particular state office, that's something I can go file a public records request about to verify whether or not that was actually the case.
Mhm.
So just having that timeline, so you're not staring at a blank, you know, page, is really just a really helpful place to start.
The blank screen is the most overwhelming thing ever. So,
Yeah.
having that, and it sounds like a lot of these things really are, they're not these big esoteric public records of like, I'm going to, do this deep dive into this very, overwhelming or unknowable space. It's more like, okay, I'm going to check employment records. I'm going to check, some of the more specific mundane things just to fact check. Is that and it also just amazes me what people put in their bios that is not true, that is so easily fact checked. Are you, as you're teaching reporters, sort of the way this works and how to navigate through the template? Are there aha moments that they're seeing that you're seeing, real change in their
I
behaviors?
think some of the tools that we're introducing them to are things that reporters maybe not necessarily thought of before.
Mhm.
Um, and one of those tools that we've found really helpful is Klaxon Cloud, which is a tool on the Muckrock suite that
Mhm.
allows you to track changes on a website. It was initially developed by the Marshall Project and now is run by Muckrock. And it's you plug
What
it
was the
into,
name again? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it properly.
that's okay. It's called Klaxon Cloud.
Okay.
You can use it to set up alerts for your candidate's website, so you can track when information on that website is added or potentially, more importantly, deleted.
Oh,
And then,
interesting.
yeah, so you can then plug that information into that timeline again and see, okay, well, this particular thing was happening on the timeline at that time. So why would, how does that connect with why this particular piece of information changed, right?
Mhm.
So being able to see that those things are changing in real time, and then also understanding what was happening already in the candidate's life, can really help you to ask questions, right? More informed, better questions to that candidate about why they made those changes to their website.
So it feels like really the simplicity of the tool helps you just kind of create those juxtapositions of and creates questions that one can ask, not necessarily. I mean, there's only one George Santos, hopefully. But in terms of like that kind of malfeasance, which was so obvious, are you finding what kinds of things are you finding sort of in the wider swath of candidates that you're doing deep dives on? Are you finding like these big areas, or is it more questions to be like, and why are you doing it this way, or what? Tell us more about, you said this, but records are showing something else.
Right. I mean, I think primarily the biggest use for these is, obviously, the big gotcha moments are, helpful to see, but in most cases you're just looking for questions, right?
Hmm.
Why did this happen, and why did it happen at this particular time, so that you can ask those questions in a more informed way. I think one of the really useful tools that we provide is also a personal financial disclosure an analytical tool. So, what reporters can do is put in all the information from a candidate's personal financial disclosures and then track that over time so that you can see changes in the candidate's financial situation over time, which allows you to then ask questions about why those changes happened, right? So, in the case of one particular candidate who is currently in office, we could see that her income changed. It almost cut in half over 3 years, and so that leads you to ask some really, interesting questions. And in this particular case, the question was, or the answer was that she had gotten divorced. Not
Mhm.
particularly, a scandalous answer to that question, but if you don't have the information to ask those kinds of questions, you could miss potentially really big, important pieces of the candidate's life. And I
Mhm.
think that's sort of one of the big things that we're seeing is it just having these questions answered helps you to put the candidate in context, helps you to give your readers a fuller picture of who this person is that they're making a decision on when they go to the ballot box.
Mhm. Well, and I think it's terrific that, so I love that this is a national training that kind of teaches these skills that people can then localize and bring back to their newsroom. So it's not, although I do want to ask about the research capabilities, because Sunlight, we're talking about disclosure, but it's also the research center. So you do support some of that work. Um, but before we get to the research side of it, could you talk a little bit about why this is so important to do in this way at this time? I think deep backgrounding on political or on any candidate has always been important, but the way you're approaching it, why do you think it's important to do now and in the way you're doing it?
That's a really, really great question. I think one of the things that we've seen over the past couple election cycles is that there are so many candidates coming to the scene now who are simply unknown, who don't
Mhm.
have a lot of background in politics, who are coming onto the scene with you know some pretty bold statements, questionable statements, and so having a sort of systematic way to look at those candidates and ask those questions in a way that can be truly revealing of what their past history is, I think is really important for us as journalists, as well as for our audiences to understand who these people are that they're making decisions about. And secondly, I think a really big part of this as well is that, as we all know, newsroom resources, the number of newsrooms at large is shrinking across the country.
Mhm.
And the number of resources and the time and the skills capacity those newsrooms have is also dwindling. And so, at a time when those resources and capacities are short, what we're hoping to provide is a boost to those newsrooms, right? So you can do that kind of deep work that your audiences want and need so that they can make those informed choices. And you can have a system for doing that. And it's not only allows you to do the work a little bit more efficiently, but it also allows you to tell your audience, look, this is our system. This is how we do this. We're not digging for dirt necessarily on a candidate. We are vetting this candidate to help you understand, to help you make informed decisions. So it provides capacity for newsrooms that are always, so thinly stretched, and it also provides transparency that they can show to their audiences and say, look, this is how we do our work. We are providing a public service to you so that you can be better informed when you go to the ballot box.
I love that idea of the providing the framework and the transparency into that framework. I think so often as newsrooms have shrunk, people, the general public, I think there's a Pew Research study on this, that people don't know a journalist, like, and so that idea of othering journalists, like, oh, well, they do this over here and we don't understand. And I think the more newsrooms can kind of apply that transparency to their own operations that we really crave in public officials and in the topical issues of the day. I think that really helps people to understand that there are professional standards, that there's a way of doing this that is appropriate and is not vindictive or like clawing through dirt or whatever the case might be, but says, yeah, this is our framework. This is how we approach candidates. Now, and I'm just curious, obviously in the 2024 election, it's a big election and there's lots of races up and down the ballot. But this is a framework that could be used really to background anyone, I'm assuming, or is it there's something specifically candidate driven about it?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. This is a format, a sort of protocol that you could use for really backgrounding anyone. And one of the things we're hoping to do post election is help newsrooms look at candidates or elected officials who've gotten into office that they may not have gotten a chance to vet before they were elected,
Hmm.
and also checking up on candidates once they've been elected. How are they doing at making good on the promises that they made while they were running for office? But this could be used for also looking at appointees, right?
Hmm.
That's something that I think we don't spend a lot of time necessarily looking into, because those candidates or those appointees are generally sort of lower profile, but they can have a big impact on the decisions that are made in our local governments in particular. So this is absolutely a resource that could be used much more broadly than just candidates.
Sure. Well, and I'm curious also, you had talked about personal finance disclosure reports. Do campaign finance reports have a role in this? And I'm thinking of that primarily because appointees really often can be tied to those campaign finance reports in various ways and kind of fly below the radar because there are so many political appointees at certainly at the local level all the way up to the highest levels, and sort of uh, pulling those individuals in kind of creates this ecosystem. So you can really see how decisions are being made against that backdrop of influence and backgrounding.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the organizations we partner with is Open Secrets, and they put on a training session. Is one of the 5 training sessions that we put on. We partner with them, and it's so incredible the sort of wealth of information that is available on their website about that helps to really track money in politics and helps to sort of put together all those pieces so you can see more clearly how the money really does influence the decisions that are made in our government at so many levels.
Absolutely. And so now, how did you come to this work? You've done a lot of sort of frontline investigative work. I know you took a little break to be a professional triathlete, which is pretty amazing. But what drew you into this work, and what attracted you to doing this at this time?
Um, yeah, so last year, Jim Mintz, our founder, sort of came to me and had this sort of audacious idea, right? Like, these elections are coming, they are so important. What can we learn from the George Santoses of the world, and how can we ensure that newsrooms and really just everyday citizens who want to be engaged and involved and understand what's going on in their government, how do we make sure that they can do the kind of research that it takes to really understand who these candidates are? And that was an idea that excited me as someone who came from local journalism, right? Like understanding how much work it takes to really understand a candidate who is particularly a candidate who's new to the scene, and how intimidating it can be, right? To start looking at that blank screen, and so it was really kind of just an exciting opportunity to think about doing something that hadn't been done before and provide a resource for reporters. I'm just thinking back to my younger Brandi self and how helpful it would have been to have a resource like this to reach out to say, help me get started here in understanding this so that I could do a better job of informing the folks who are reading my stories about what was going on in their communities. So yeah, it was really just a fun opportunity to start something new, and that's sort of been a part of my career all along the way. Like, I was one of the first employees at the Texas Tribune, and walked into that empty space of a newsroom. We went shopping at IKEA our second day to get desks. So
At
that
least you
kind of
got what you want then.
yes, um, and so being in that kind of startup environment where we're creating something that is really useful to our community, and in this instance, I'm hoping that uh, other journalists are really our community, and just so excited to have this opportunity to help make their lives and jobs easier.
Well, and I also feel like with the how local newsrooms are shrinking, I feel like we're losing a lot of institutional knowledge. There's not the grizzled old guy in the back who's like, "Oh, let me tell you about when we were here in 1972," or whatever the case might be. And so I think there's so many idealistic, young, passionate journalists that are coming out that don't quite know all of the institutional backgrounding or even how to navigate some of those spaces. And I think that lack of experience can really be a detriment to newsrooms who are trying to uncover big stories, and they're doing a lot of wonderful work. But I think a framework to kind of keep it all organized and almost like a paper trail, so that you can say, if I would imagine if a newsroom adopts something like this, then they can keep it in a central spot. Everyone can kind of add to it as they go along, and you have these dossiers on individuals as political appointees maybe become candidates for larger offices and so forth. You have a much stronger institutional knowledge. Is that kind of the hope of where you're going with this?
Yeah, exactly. I think you probably said it better than I even could have. I mean, I remember when I started out as a reporter covering the Texas Capitol, I would have been completely lost were it not for the folks who had so much institutional knowledge around me, who were there to
Mhm.
help me out and boost me up and help me understand how things worked. And I think you're exactly right that so many of those sort of folks who had that deep institutional knowledge are not in the newsrooms anymore. And so, to the extent that we can help fill in some of those gaps and help new reporters and younger reporters, and even reporters who may just not have this particular skill set to do this kind of work, is really exactly our goal. And the other point that you made about these documents, these timelines being living, breathing documents that are going to continue to help newsrooms to report on folks who are in power in their communities, not just for one particular election cycle, but for their entire potential future career. It's really an invaluable tool to start building that institutional knowledge internally that's going to be there, hopefully regardless of when reporters move on to other jobs or what have you. So
Right.
exactly right. Building that institutional knowledge is, I think, a huge goal.
Yeah. And so I wanted to turn a little bit to the second part of the name of the organization, the Research Center. So Sunlight Research Center. You all are doing some very interesting things regarding research. So it's not just teaching individuals, but you're there for the work. So can you tell us a little bit about the research side of what you're doing?
Sure. So what we are doing is building a research help desk. So um, if you've ever worked at a larger news organization like the New York Times, ProPublica, these organizations have research desks, right? So a breaking
Mhm.
news event happens, or uh, a reporter wants to begin research on an investigative story. A research desk is a place where they can turn to sort of build the foundational information for that story. So helping find documents, helping find data sets that can be
Mhm.
analyzed, and those are such hugely helpful resources for those newsrooms. I remember being at the LA Times and having the ability to call in the research desk to when we started an investigative project to set the foundation for those stories saved us so much time. And so what we kind of thought was, well, how useful, how incredibly helpful would that be if newsrooms across the country had access to a research desk that could
Mhm.
help them build those foundations. And so we've started partnering with some newsrooms to pull documents on, in this particular instance, on candidates, given the timing of where we are, but pulling documents that they may need, um, pulling data sets and helping to analyze those data sets, helping them put together the timelines and source lists, um, so that they can have a really strong starting place to do that reporting themselves.
That sounds so incredibly useful. And as you were speaking, though, I was thinking the timeliness of the election and the sclerotic nature of getting public records requests. When you're talking about um, some of the data sets that are available, can you kind of just separate out for us a little bit, like, what do you look at? Like, what's a public records request that may take, 30, 40, 60 years, days, whatever, to come to fruition? And what can you find, sort of what data sets are sort of at the ready in your mind, and sort of how do you balance those two types of pieces of information?
Sure. It's a good question. And there, what's interesting about it is that there are so many bits of information that really are available to us without necessarily having to take the step of filing a FOIA request. Obviously, that's something that comes in very handy when it's needed, but we also find it helpful to think about what you can get before filing a FOIA request. So, one really good example is we worked with the Nevada Independent on a story about all the federal candidates in their area, and they wanted to know which of those candidates had received PPP loans over the course of their tenure before running for office. And
And
so,
actually, before we go there, PPP is the can you explain what that is, because pandemic's just fading in our heads sometimes.
yes, it was the Paycheck Protection Program from the pandemic, and it allowed businesses to take out generally forgivable loans so that they could continue paying paychecks. And a lot of candidates we've seen have criticized some of those loans as sort of government bailouts.
Hmm.
Um, and I think in the case of the Nevada Independent, they wanted to understand, how the rhetoric matched up with the candidate's actual financial situation. And so what we were able to do is we did a search for all the candidates' businesses and their spouses' businesses. Those are all records that are pretty easily obtainable online through the Secretary of State. So we obtained all of their business identification records. So we knew what companies they owned. And then we searched USA spending to find out all the government loans that each of those candidates had taken out. And then we were able to provide a sort of accounting for all of those loans. And it showed that, if I remember correctly, 8 or 9 of the candidates had actually taken out PPP loans
Oh,
during the term
interesting.
before they were elected. So there's stories like that where it's just important to know where you need to look for the information, and then it can prevent you from having to file lengthy FOIA requests, or at least
Sure.
lengthy in terms of time to get them.
No, and that makes perfect sense. And it always is amazing to me how you usually can triangulate and figure out how to get that information in spaces other than FOIA requests. Honestly, you really just have to know where to look. And there's so much information out there. And I think that's one of the big challenges in journalism now is I'm always just stunned, especially in investigative journalism, like just how much data management goes into being a journalist these days, because you're juggling all those bits of information. You have to really be aware of what information is out there in the world. It's like finding a needle in a haystack a little bit. So, like, how have you guys developed your magic and mystery about knowing where to look and how to look?
So one of the things we're actually working on right now, and we're hoping to have available in the next couple of weeks or so, is an online searchable research guide that
Hmm.
is really comprehensive, that allows journalists to search by topic for data sets that will be helpful to them. And what we think is exceptionally helpful about this research guide is that it not only gives you a link for a resource that you should search, but it tells you what you can find there and how to search that particular data set
Mm.
as well, so that you can be a little bit more targeted in how you do your research, and really have another, yet again, a place to start, right? Asking, what's the topic I'm interested in, where are the places I look, and how do I look there?
And now, do you feel like even very localized candidates benefit from federal data sets, or is in your research tool, are you drilling down? I mean, the U.S. is a big place. So when you're kind of figuring this out, are you looking at local sources just yet? Or are you kind of building that out as you're helping different newsrooms or different areas?
Definitely, it's something that we're working on building out. We have a fairly large picture of federal sources that are available, but we also talk about, particularly at the local level, searching places like local courts, searching
Hmm.
places like your state Secretary of State's office for business records, searching local tax assessors for property records, going through those sort of local elements that are really important, not just for local candidates, but also for federal candidates as well.
Hmm. Terrific. And so, where do you see things going now? I know you're at the time of our conversation that we're recording, you're about to launch a new website, and there's lots of changes on the horizon. But where do you see this project going in the next few years? You've gotten some really good, you've got a great start. And so, where do you want to go from here?
I would say that we have fairly audacious goals. Um,
I love
we're
that.
that's great. Um, so bold and also scary, but exciting mostly. So our hope is that over the next from 2000 over 2005, we hope to reach about 150 newsrooms with our training and our research desk help. So after the election, we're going forward to doing, more government accountability post-election work, and we hope to continue going with that next year and expanding the number of newsrooms that we're able to help with both training workshops that are designed around what newsrooms need to know. So our hope is in working with newsrooms on the research desk side that will give us a really good insight into what skill sets newsrooms are, sort of what skills gaps they have, so that we can
Mhm.
then design our training around those bits of information that we're learning from talking to newsrooms, and provide them training that really helps give them those skill sets so that they can do more on their own on their own.
And so, how do people access that training? I know you have a 5-part series that you've been running this summer that's free to newsrooms. Can you talk a little bit about how one would access that training? Or, I mean, by the time audience is listening to this, that window closes. So, how can they access the resources that you have and take advantage of them?
Sure. So right now the training is available. Our last session starts September 25th. Um, and you can apply for that through our website or through the Night Election Hub. And
And
there's
what's your
potential.
website address, your URL?
Oh, it's www.sunlightresearchcenter.net.
Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah. And so you can apply there for the training, and there's a potential that we may add another training series before the election starts, and we will certainly have some more training coming up after the election as well. So just keep your eye on that site for more training sessions as they come up. And then Research Desk Help, similarly, you can apply through the Night Election Hub at that website, or you can apply directly through our website. And we have a few slots left before the election to help specific newsrooms out. So now would be the time to get those requests in.
All right, great. Well, it sounds like you have a wonderful host of opportunities out there to really strengthen reporting and research, and provide more transparency and clarity to elections, which is, I think, a critical space right now. So thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for spending some time with us today. It's been terrific.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been really a pleasure to talk with you. And yeah, thank you for all your work.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to 5 Dubs with Rebecca Snyder. Please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts so that others can find us. What do you want to know about local journalism? Email me at rsnyder, SNYDER, at mddcpress.com. Interested in supporting our podcast and journalism? Please donate to our 501c3 Press Foundation. Find out more and see the full episode list and show notes at www.5-dubs.com.